The best way to learn a language? Immersion, living where the language is spoken and using it every day. But if that's not in the cards for you this year, you can still learn a language the second best way, and that's with Babbel. Be a better you in 2024 with Babbel, the science-backed language learning app that actually works. Don't pay hundreds of dollars for private tutors or waste hours on apps that don't really help you speak the language. Babbel's quick 10-minute lessons are handcrafted by over 200 language experts to help you start speaking a new language in as little as 3 weeks. Babbel's designed by real people for real conversations. Babbel's tips and tools are approachable, accessible, rooted in real-life situations, and delivered with conversation-based teaching so you're ready to practice what you've learned in the real world. For instance, I've been using Babbel's convenient courses to help me learn basic conversational skills in German while I'm getting ready for a little trip I'm planning. It's not a language I'd ever studied before, but I find the lessons really easy and kind of like hand-holding me through learning a completely new language to me. And it's reassuring to know that with the help of Babbel, I'll be able to greet people, order food, and ask for directions without having to consult language apps while I'm in Deutschland. I'm still learning. Studies from Yale, Michigan State University, and others continue to prove Babbel is better. One study found that using Babbel for 15 hours is equivalent to a full semester at college. Babbel has over 16 million subscriptions sold. Plus, all of Babbel's 14 award-winning language courses are backed by their 20-day money-back guarantee. Here's a special limited-time deal for our listeners. Right now, get up to 60% off your Babbel subscription, but only for our listeners at babbel.com/vulgar. Get up to 60% off at babbel.com/vulgar, spelled BABBEL.com/vulgar. Rules and restrictions may apply.
The land down under has never been easier to reach. United Airlines has more flights between the U.S. and Australia than any other U.S. airline, so you can fly nonstop to destinations like Sydney, Melbourne, and Brisbane. Explore dazzling cities, savor the very best of Aussie cuisine, and get up close and personal with the wildlife. Who doesn't want to hold a koala? Go to united.com/Australia to book your adventure.
Hello and welcome to Vulgar History, a feminist women's history comedy podcast. My name is Anne Foster, and in this series, we're looking at revolutions around the world, including, but not limited to, the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Haitian Revolution, and also just people whose lives themselves were revolutionary in different ways. Ultimately, the long thesis of this series, which is going to go on for, I have to say, a really long time. That's why I'm taking my time. Eventually, we're going to be getting to Marie Antoinette herself. Technically, the name of this season is How Do You Solve a Problem Like Marie Antoinette? And I mean that literally, because the issue with her life is that she eventually got caught up in this kind of wave of revolutions that was happening all around the world, kind of like a wrong place, wrong time situation. But to understand the French Revolution, I think you need to understand the American Revolution and just the spirit of revolution that was happening all around the world in the 18th century. Which brings us to New Zealand. I've wanted to do a New Zealand episode for an incredibly long time because I've been doing this podcast now for 4 years. And New Zealand listeners are some of the first people who reached out to me that made me realize, like, oh, there's people listening to this show from all around the world. And I've wanted to cover a New Zealand story, and it just took me a while to find one that fit into this show and that fit into this theme. And it actually fits really perfectly. So I don't want to spoil what we're going to talk about in the episode coming up, but what I will say just is place setting, just so you're just like, what does New Zealand have to do with revolutions of the 18th century? Because New Zealand, also aka Aotearoa, is one of the last places in the sequence of like British colonial things. It was one of the last places that eventually became part of the British Empire. That didn't happen until the 19th century. In the time period we're looking at, New Zealand was 100% just the Maori people were living on there. The first white person or the first kind of British explorer to head out there was in 1769. And the story we're going to be talking here takes place in the early 1800s. So it was still kind of a place where, we'll talk about this in the episode, people would kind of go to Eoteria to trade maybe now and then, but there was not settlements going on there. So again, what does this have to do with the rest of the season? Well, so England used to send its convicts, like people who had been arrested and convicted of crimes, to their colonies in America as a way to kind of, because they were just really trying to get as many kind of white people in America as possible to really develop that colonial project. But then when the American Revolution happened, the United States was like, no thanks, please stop sending British convicts over here. And then England was like, well, what are we going to do with all these convicts? And so for a while, they literally just kept them floating around on a ship, I think like in the River Thames, just kind of like, what do we do with all of them? And then they're like, Australia. So then they started sending these convicts to Australia. Australia, very close to New Zealand. And that's kind of the person who we talk about in this story. That's how she wound up in New Zealand. And it's an interesting story in the sense of she starts off in one place, she goes to another place, she winds up in another place. But Charlotte Badger is most remembered and best known, as much as she is known, for her significance to the history of New Zealand. And I do want to give a special shout out to Zoe, listener Zoe, who I randomly on my Instagram one day was just like, is anyone from New Zealand, Aotearoa, able to like help me with some questions? And Zoe hopped right on, and she's been so helpful with kind of orienting me to understand various things about New Zealand history so I could do this episode. I could prepare for this episode. So she's now our official New Zealand cultural emissary. But I also learned so much about New Zealand history and about Charlotte Badger from today's guest, who is Jennifer Ashton. Jennifer Ashton is an Auckland-based technical writer and editor. In 2012, she completed a PhD in history at the University of Auckland, and she is the author of the book Thief, Convict, Pirate, Wife. Subtitle, The Many Histories of Charlotte Badger, which really came in clutch for me in learning the story because I found the story so fascinating. But then Charlotte Badger, like so many of the stories that we've looked at on this podcast already, are kind of the myth about her sort of supersedes the actual truth about who she actually was. Jennifer Ashton really put in the work. She was like literally flying around the world to find archives in various different countries to really track down who actually was Charlotte Badger. And I'm so happy that Jennifer agreed to be on this podcast. And so please enjoy this episode about Charlotte Badger with special guest Jennifer Ashton. So I'm joined today by Jennifer Ashton, who is the author of Thief, Convict, Pirate, Wife, The Many Histories of Charlotte Badger. And welcome, Jennifer.
Thank you, Anne. It's very nice to be here.
So my first question for you, just to set the scene, do you remember when you first heard about Charlotte Badger?
There's a small amount about her in a museum in the National New Zealand Museum Te Papa in Wellington. And I thought, oh, that's an interesting sounding character. And then I was writing a book, a doctorate, as a result of a doctorate, about John Webster, who was a trader, timber trader, just north of where I live in New Zealand. And in order to write about him, I had to do a lot of background reading about that part of the country. And she kept coming up. And because I was writing a biography of Webster, I was kind of interested in how you go about writing the life histories of people who don't leave a lot of information behind. And she seemed like a particular challenge because there's almost nothing. So, yeah, I was interested in her both because she just sounded like she had this incredible life, but also as a sort of challenge about, how would you actually write something about someone like her? So that's kind of how I hooked onto her originally.
And I've talked about other people like this in the podcast before, where there's a legend or a mythology that builds up around a person that's not always telling the story of the real person. So that she has that real dichotomy about her where there's these legends of this pirate, but then actually, who was she really?
Yeah, that's right. And there's a few general histories of New Zealand written by, quite big name academics in this country. And they told the story about her, about how she had taken part in this act of piracy in Sydney, and they'd come to New Zealand. And she had apparently led the mutiny And then she'd sort of stayed in New Zealand for a while and married a local Maori chief, and then possibly escaped and gone to Tonga or maybe even to the US. And that story's been repeated quite a lot, as I say, in some fairly well-known history books. But when you dig into it, actually, there's a lot of that doesn't stand up to scrutiny, which is sort of kind of where my book came in, I think.
Exactly. And that's why I found your book so helpful, because before I found that, I think I was just coming across that mythology. And that just kind of tweaked my senses, where I was like, there's no proof of any of this. This just kind of sounds like a tall tale. And a lot of it is.
A lot of it is, yeah.
So she was, if we're going to go kind of through, it's also interesting that her life is, there's a part in England, Australia, New Zealand. So it's kind of takes place in different places. So even the fact she's born in England, I thought, oh, that's surprising, because I hadn't thought of that. So can you describe what you were able to find out about her earliest years?
Yeah. And I think the thing about Charlotte Badger is, there is this mythology about her, which is, as you say, a tall tale. But actually, to me, the actual story of her life, which you're able to kind of find through documentary evidence, is, it's just as interesting. So she starts off she's born in 1778 in a town called Bromsgrove, which is now on commuter town for Birmingham in England. Her father's a labourer. He's kind of at the very bottom of English society. And when she's 18, she breaks into a house of a guy called Benjamin Wright, and she steals quite a lot of money from him. It's a half crown and I think about 5 guineas. So a pretty significant amount of money. And she's convicted of that. And she then spends 4 years in Worcester jail awaiting transportation to Australia, because this is the early days of convict transportation to New South Wales. So that's where she's ultimately headed. And she's convicted in 1796.
So she would be I'm just thinking she's a young teenager at this time.
She's about 18 when she breaks in. So she's quite, it's quite and the interesting thing about that is housebreaking was a crime that was more normally carried out by men. So she was quite, she's something a bit brazen about that crime coming from such a young woman. So yeah, she does her 4 years in jail, and then she's put on a transport ship, and she arrives in Sydney in 1801.
So I want to talk a bit about her. You mentioned that this was a brazen crime, especially for a young woman. The severity of her punishment seems so extreme to me. Even just 4 years in jail. And you have some theories in your book. You talk about why she might have done this and why the punishment was what it was.
Yeah, there's a bit of speculation about her relationship with Benjamin Wright. There's a couple of writers who think she may have been employed by him, it's possible that she'd been like a house servant, and that possibly that relationship had broken down. Or, maybe he was just, a local wealthy person, and the family was in desperate need of money. We can't really be sure why she commits the crime. But she then fails to benefit from any kind of discretion that's built into the justice system. So at any point, Benjamin Wright could have said, okay, give me the money back and we'll forget about it. Or the grand jury could have said, yeah, no, we're not going to charge her. So there's all these steps along the way that someone could have said, no, we're not going to charge this young woman. She doesn't benefit from any of that discretion. So there's obviously something about her, there's something about the crime she's committed that is taken really seriously. And at the time, there was this thing called the Bloody Code in operation in England, which kind of property crimes were viewed extremely seriously. And I think it was partly the result of the coming industrial revolution. People were acquiring all these goods for the first time, and they didn't want them stolen. So if somebody stole your hard-earned money or your goods, then that was taken really seriously. And she when she was convicted, it was actually she actually got the death penalty. Like a lot of people in the category, she was originally sentenced to death, and then you have to, the judge has to write off to the king and ask for the royal mercy. So she's pardoned, and then she can just be transported for the rest of her life. And that's what happened to her, and it's what happened to thousands of people. But as I say, in order to get to that point, she had to kind of miss out on all these other discretionary steps where she could have just been sent home and with a slap on the wrist.
So the Industrial Revolution is kind of coming. At this time in England, as I understand it, there is general unrest just because of widespread poverty and things like this. She committed this crime presumably because she and her family were in need of money, or maybe there was some form of vengeance. Maybe she had been let go from that position. So she was in a real hard spot. She would have known too that this would be the punishment if she was caught, and it seems like she was caught quite quickly.
Quite quickly. Yeah, I used to try and figure that one out, and I just kind of thought, well, young people, often don't have that sense of, I better not do this because there'll be consequences. I think at the time you're not really thinking of the consequences, particularly, as you say, if you're angry, if you're desperate, if something's going on, then you kind of, you're just focusing on what you sort of think you need to do next. But yeah, you're right about the Industrial Revolution as well. And, there was this explosion in England of the young population. There were a lot of young people in the country at the time. And I think the authorities were kind of worried about them and how to control them. So one of the reasons I think she doesn't get the benefit of the doubt is that they're worried about young people. And they're also, she also doesn't benefit from the fact that she's got a male accomplice. Because if she'd had a male accomplice, they might have said, oh, well, we'll punish him but not her because she's under his influence. She acts alone. So she's a young person. She's done something outrageous, and she's a young woman acting alone. So, that's kind of particularly scary.
And at this time, the whole concept of sending prisoners to Australia, what was the intent of that? Because people were sent to Australia not to be returned after necessarily. It was just kind of...
No.
Was it partially to build up the colony there?
Yeah, so at the time there wasn't the concept that we have these days of rehabilitation. So we send people to prison and we try and rehabilitate them while they're in there, and we think that there's some kind of chance of doing that. At the time, there was no idea that these people could be reformed. They were kind of seen as, criminal types, and the best you could do was just get rid of them. So, previously they had been going to the American colonies, and after the American War of Independence, that wasn't an option anymore. So for a while, they actually kept men, I think, exclusively on these ships that were moored just off the coast or in the Thames, these sort of holding pens, really. And then after James Cook's visit to Voyages of Discovery, he comes upon Botany Bay in New South Wales, and Joseph Banks, who was the botanist on his first voyage, comes back and says, "Oh, this is a really good place that you could, consider setting up as the new convict destination." So that's what they do in 1788, and so the idea is, okay, this is the new place where we can just offload all our criminal types. But there is this discussion in some historical circles, among historical writers, there has been this discussion about, well, what was the point of setting up New South Wales? Was it just to dump these people, or was it to kind of set up this colony in the South Pacific that could kind of compete with France, because that Britain and France were having this kind of global contest at the time. And if the idea was, okay, well, maybe if we stake a claim in Australia or on the Australian continent, that will kind of keep the French at bay. And I think it's kind of doing both of those things. It serves both of those purposes. It's definitely a long way away. Those people are never coming back. If you send your convicts there, most of them, the overwhelming majority, will just never come back. But also, it allows Britain to kind of set up camp in the South Pacific as well.
And in terms of just, it's so far away, you delve into this in your book in a way that I found. You described how long it took for the ship to get from England to Australia, and it was something like a year, right?
Yeah, it's months. I think they set out at the end. The ship that Charlotte was on, they set out at the end of 1800, and they get there in June 1801. And that was kind of the case, for a long time. Even my own family came decades later, and it was about a 6-month journey on a sailing ship, and it was hazardous even in the sort of mid to later 19th century. But at the time that Charlotte Badger was setting out on those convict ships, it was really dangerous because the early convict transportation ships weren't really subject to very much government regulation at all. So the government would hire these ships, often East Indiamen. So they were the ships built by for the East India Company to travel from England to either Bombay or Calcutta. So they're really big ships. But they were kind of privately operated. So there wasn't a lot of, oversight in terms of what was happening. And the second fleet, the first fleet that goes to Australia is 1788, arrives in January 1788. And the second fleet, I think, is 1789 or 1790. I can't quite remember, but it's not that long after, and it has a terrible time. There's a shocking mortality rate on some of I think there's 3 ships in the second fleet, and one of them in particular has just a shocking mortality rate. And that kind of continues, and the ship that Charlotte Badger was on, the one that had gone just before her, the Hillsborough, I think it was typhoid or something, typhoid or typhus, had gone through everybody, on that ship, and again there'd been this shocking mortality rate. So it was extremely dangerous. You got on that ship and you didn't actually know that you were going to make it to the other end. And I think she was on board a ship called the Earl Cornwallis. It was taking supplies to the new colony at Sydney Cove, and a lot of those supplies got ruined because of the seawater kind of got in, and they had to the route that they took. They would leave England, they would go sort of down the Spanish Portuguese coast, and then they'd shoot over to Rio de Janeiro, and then they go down to Cape Town, go around the Cape of Good Hope, and then head across the Southern Ocean. And it was a pretty precarious, dangerous trip for her and for all convicts, really.
And in addition, in terms of the danger on the ship as well, it's far more men than women. So there's also sexual danger as well.
Yes, that's right. Particularly with the crew, I think there was a bit of kind of predation, I think, going on. Some of those relationships were probably consensual, but I think there was a bit that you didn't really have a choice. If you wanted to kind of survive on that ship, you had to give in to the crew. There were a range of dangers that you faced, particularly as a woman on those ships.
And this is where, again, you mentioned this in your book, but just picturing Charlotte Badger, who's this young woman. By now she's in her early 20s. She's been in jail for 4 years. And then suddenly she's taken so far out of her lived experience. Like, first of all, just being on a ship. Chances are she's never been on a ship. And then for so long, like everything she was brought up knowing is not useful anymore. She's in this completely different world. So it's impressive that she survived that sea voyage at all. And she did.
Yeah, and she did. Yeah. Yeah. And then you get off at the other end.
And you're in Australia.
You're in Australia. And I don't know how many of your listeners have been to Australia, but it's, Sydney's pretty different from Worcestershire. The climate is harsh. It's, it's obviously hot. They get flash flooding. The early colony it really struggles to feed people because they try to grow crops, and those crops get destroyed by flash flooding. So yeah, there's again, you get off the ship and you think you've dealt with the dangers of being at sea, and then you get to your destination, and all of a sudden, there's all these other troubles and dangers that you have to deal with.
And I got the sense that no one there really knew what to do. It's not you got there and there's this well-established, thriving colony that you could join. Everyone was kind of, no one had been there for very long because it was still a pretty new thing.
Yeah. I think the colonies, by 1801, it's beginning to kind of put down roots. But certainly in the 1790s, Sydney had a really troubled birth, I think, again, in terms of just sustaining itself, and really struggling to sustain itself. And things are getting a bit better, but there's also ongoing conflict with, the people who are already living there, the Aboriginal people who are already living there. And there's kind of raids on sort of settler outposts. So yeah, it is a difficult place to be.
And can you just explain what the prisoners were doing there? Like, they were sent to Australia because it was just seen as you're prisoners, you're criminals. We don't want you in England. But then once they get to Australia, they're not really put in a jail. They're kind of put to labor to clear the land and things.
That's right. Yeah. So it's not like a prison farm. It's more like I suppose it's more like a free range prison farm. So because the colonial government is not particularly strong, there isn't a big bureaucracy there to kind of organise people. That sort of comes later. Things do become much more regimented in New South Wales, but early on, people are put to labour. People have to perform certain tasks in order to keep the colony going. But you also have quite a lot of freedom. Like, once you've done the hours that are required of you, you can go off and kind of work for yourself and earn some money for yourself, and sell your labour to maybe one of the free settlers who need some extra help. So it's this weird sort of dichotomy, in a way, that you've been sent to the other side of the world. You have been banished from your home. You have been labelled a criminal. But you get to this place, and life is hard, but you do have a measure of freedom as well.
It's funny to me, like, just understanding that. It seems like the concept of your punishment is just you have to be in Australia. That's the punishment. But once you're there, you can you have some freedom. So
yeah, you can get on with it.
Which is interesting, because she is eventually freed.
Yeah, she's eventually, I could never quite figure out when this happened, but she is eventually freed by servitude. So she gets convicted for a 7-year sentence. I think the sentence actually goes on longer than that, possibly because just nobody gets around to kind of doing the paperwork. But eventually, I forget which census it is, but sort of by about 1815, 1820, she's recorded as being freed by servitude. So she's done her time, and she's a free woman.
And she's also had a child.
Yeah, she had, I think in all, she had possibly 3 children, but only one seems to have survived. And her name was Maria or Mariah. And she was born, I think, about 1811, 1812. But she had an earlier on, she had given birth to a child who doesn't seem to have survived. And that child may have died in New Zealand.
Well, because now in her story, we're getting up to the part that the mythology is all built about, which is she goes on a ship to New Zealand.
She gets on a ship to what's now Tasmania, what was then Van Diemen's Land. So that island off the south coast of Australia. And so what's happening is Hobart, which is now the capital of Tasmania these days, it was being established as a kind of new town, a satellite town for Sydney, and they needed people to go there. They were sending members of the Marine Corps to set up this new settlement, and the Marine Corps needed help of various kinds. And I think, again, it's really impossible to tell exactly why she was going, but the best guess is that she was going to act as domestic help in that new settlement. And so, yeah, she got on board a ship called the Venus, and they were headed ultimately for Hobart, but things go awry on the way.
And this is where stories vary what exactly happened.
So what we can establish from the man who was in charge of the ship, he was master captain. His name was Samuel Rodman Chase. He leaves behind an account of what he says happened. So they set out. He's taking supplies from Sydney to Hobart for the new settlement. He's also taking a few passengers, and he's got a crew on board. His first mate is a man called Benjamin Kelly. And they set out, and things begin to go wrong right from the start. They spend a couple of weeks at a place called Twofold Bay, which is on the New South Wales coast. And Chase seems to be interested in kind of reclaiming iron from a ship that's wrecked there. But relationships start to kind of break down. There's tensions between Chase and the crew. They eventually set out for Hobart, and Chase records that there's a woman on board called Catherine Haggerty, and she's becoming quite feisty, quite difficult. She throws a box of papers overboard. She seems like she might be in a relationship with Kelly, and possibly she's taking his side in Kelly's arguments with Chase. And they get to the Tasmanian coast, place called Port Dalrymple, and they anchor there. Chase goes on shore to kind of report to the local authorities, and while he's away, the crew basically mutiny and steal the ship and head for New Zealand, and that much we can establish. But what actually happened on board is, and who kind of led the mutiny, is the bit where it all becomes a bit speculative, and where Charlotte Badger's role has been the subject of mythologizing.
And what was the status of New Zealand at this point? Because Australia, prison colonies are springing up there, but what's happening in New Zealand?
So New Zealand is 100% controlled by Maori, the local Maori population. Various tribes, what we refer to as iwi, they are in control of New Zealand, and there are no white settlements or Pākehā settlements. There are, however, visiting whaling ships. So the whaling and sealing industries are getting underway around the New Zealand coast. So whaling ships would go to Sydney or Norfolk Island, which is slightly north of New Zealand, between kind of New Zealand and Australia. And then they would come and fish, as they called it, around the coast of New Zealand. And some Maori chiefs, particularly in the northern part of the country, they were interested in cultivating relationships with these whaling captains and trading with them. So they would, offer them safe harbour. They would offer them water, food, shelter, and that's kind of what was happening in New Zealand at the time. So when the Venus sets out for New Zealand, they know that there are these places in the north of the country where you can get shelter.
I was just curious why that was their destination, this mutinous crew. So they had a plan. They knew that
they had a plan, and I think Benjamin Kelly had been on board another ship that had visited the Bay of Islands. So this is the place in the north of New Zealand that was a particular particularly favoured spot for these whaling ships. And I'm pretty sure he had been on a ship that had visited the bay. So he kind of knew what awaited them if they came here.
Do we know where exactly they touched down? Was it in one of these ports?
Yeah, so it's in the Bay of Islands. It's a place I'm pretty sure it's a place called Wairoa Bay, which is it's a lovely place even today. It's really lovely, and it could potentially offer them everything they needed, but they were going to have to live in a Maori community under the protection of a Maori chief, and he was going to have to agree to accept them and offer them shelter, because it just really wasn't possible in 1806 when all of this was happening. It wasn't possible to come to New Zealand as a European sailor and not live on the terms of the local leadership.
And they wouldn't have been able to return to Australia or to England because of the mutiny, I would presume.
That's right. It's kind of for most of them in particular, for the men and for people like Benjamin Kelly, although he was American, so he kind of he had a way out, I guess. But for a lot of the other people on board, it was a one-way trip.
And so Charlotte and her child, I think, just so people are clear, she had a young child with her during all of this.
She does, yeah. There's a public notice issued in the wake of the mutiny listing the people on board, and she's listed in that public notice as having an infant child. So I can't find any record of that child actually being born. That's not necessarily unusual, but yeah, she had a small child with her.
And so she explain what happens, because she stays behind in New Zealand, but the others leave or something like that.
Yeah, so they get to the Bay of Islands, and pretty much they split into two groups. About half a dozen of them: Benjamin Kelly, Catherine Haggerty, Charlotte Badger, another convict called John William Lancashire, and potentially two cabin boys. They get off the ship in the bay, and I think that's because, as I say, Kelly had been there before. He kind of knew, I think, that this would be a good place to stop. The rest of the crew say, no, we're not interested in stopping. We're going to keep going. And so, yes, another sailor takes charge of the ship, of the Venus, and it heads off down the coast, and it's never seen again. So that's kind of, we just don't know what happens to the Venus. But yeah, that's kind of the last that we ever hear of them.
And so Charlotte, correct me if I'm wrong, but she's maybe the first European woman to live in New Zealand?
Yeah, there's actually, she and Catherine Haggerty are the first European women to live amongst Maori. So about 10 years earlier, there had been another couple of women who had ended up shipwrecked at the very bottom of the South Island in a place called Dusky Sound. But they don't interact with Maori. They're there for a few months, but yeah, they don't. There's no record of any kind of interaction with Maori. But Charlotte Badger and Catherine Haggerty are the first European women to live in a local community.
And they're there for a year or so.
They're there for, Charlotte Badger is there, I think, for about 6 to 8 months. Yeah. And Catherine Haggerty at some point dies inside that 6 to 8 month window. Yeah, she's recorded as having died. And we don't know how, and we don't know why, and we don't know exactly when.
I mean, I guess how much can be known, but we just know she's living amongst the Maori for 6-7 months. And now for a quick advertising break.
As a podcast network, our first priority has always been audio and the stories we're able to share with you. But at Realm, we also sell some pretty cool merch, and organizing that was made both possible and easy with Shopify. When you think about successful businesses like Aloe or Allbirds or Skims, an often overlooked secret is the business behind the business that makes selling and, for shoppers, buying simple. For millions of businesses, that business is Shopify. That's because nobody does selling better than Shopify. It's the home of the #1 checkout on the planet. And the not-so-secret secret that's definitely worth talking about is that Shop Pay boosts conversions up to 50%. That's more happy customers and way more sales going. If you're hoping to grow your business, your commerce platform better be ready to sell wherever your customers are scrolling or strolling, on the web, in your store, in their feed, and everywhere in between. Businesses that sell more, sell on Shopify. Upgrade your business and get the same checkout we use with Shopify. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/realm, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/realm to upgrade your selling today. Shopify.com/realm.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See detail.
People often look at me with confusion when I ask them what their only one in the room story is. They think it has to be like mine, where I went to a 600-person event and discovered that I was the only Black person there. I know. Horrifying, right? Hi, I'm Laura Cathcart-Robbins, and I am the host and creator of the podcast Only One in the Room. Every week, my co-host Scott Slaughter and I invite you to join us for an hour and lose yourself in someone's only one story. This podcast is for anyone who has ever felt alone in a room full of people, which is to say that this podcast is for everyone.
I'm Brennan Storr.
I'm Paul Bestall.
We're the Ghost Story Guys.
And every 2 weeks, we explore first-person stories of encounters with the paranormal from all around the world.
Then we have some fun reacting to those stories. We like to say our goal is to scare the hell out of you, then make you laugh.
Belief in the paranormal is not required. All you need is a love of great storytelling and curiosity about the world around you.
Come find the Ghost Story Guys on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and everywhere else fine podcasts live, or at ghoststoryguys.com.
And we're back. Just in terms, I'm just thinking back to this, young woman born in this poor family in England. Like, she's on yet another unexpected, unprecedented journey for someone like her, and she again survives.
Absolutely. I mean, I think going to Sydney would be strange enough. The change in climate, the change in the physical environment. The plants, the sky at night is different. Everything in Sydney would have been different, but you're still living in a European settlement surrounded by people who dress like you, who look like you, who speak the same language as you. You encounter Aboriginal people probably, but they're at arm's length. And then she comes to New Zealand and she's living in an environment that is, again, even more different. Again, the physical environment is different, the climate is different. But you're now living amongst people who don't speak the same language as you, who don't look like you, who don't dress like you, and you're living on their terms. It's their community that you're living in, and you have to just fit in somehow. Even though communication would be a barrier, you just have to kind of do your very best to fit in. And I've thought a lot about how strange that would be, and what a modern day equivalent would be. And it would kind of be like going into the depths of the Amazon rainforest and finding one of those, communities that don't have a lot of contact with the outside world, and just kind of having to live there for 6 months. That's the equivalent. If you've come from a small industrializing town in England and this is where you end up, it's an extraordinary journey.
And I'm thinking too, in terms of a contemporary person, it's hard for me to think of, just in terms of the level of, not specifically education, but just in our world today, there's documentaries and there's videos, YouTube. Like, I've seen what other cultures are like, even if I've not lived amongst them, but she wouldn't have ever known. She would just show up there and she can't be like, oh, this is kind of like this, okay. Like to her, it would just be,
Yeah.
she's no frame of reference for.
There's no frame of
Yeah.
reference. That's right. Yeah. It's, like I say, it's very, very hard to get your head around how different it would have been for her.
And she is
Yeah.
able, someone comes to get her eventually, and she does choose to leave. She chooses to leave. I guess she could have stayed, but that.
Yeah. So they arrive in New Zealand about July 1806, I think. And around Christmas time, there is a captain whose name is Eba Bunker. And he shows up because he's heard about this group that are living at the bay, and I think he knows that they are from the Venus. So he calls in there, and he sees her. He meets her. Catherine Haggerty has by this point died, but he offers Charlotte Badger a return voyage to Sydney, and she says, "No thanks. I'll stay here and take my chances." But at some point, not very long after that, another whaling captain shows up, and she's changed her mind, and he's on a ship called the Indispensable, and he takes her to Norfolk Island, and that's how she leaves New Zealand, and that's, I think, early 1807, so maybe kind of January, February 1807.
And this is, again, just there's so much, because we don't know anything about her inner life. There's no diary or anything like that. But why would she say no and then she would say yes to the next person? What's changed? It's so fascinating to think about.
Yeah, I wonder whether it's something to do with the infant child that she's got, because when she gets on the Indispensable, there's a very brief record of her arriving in Norfolk Island, it's leaving Norfolk Island, and there is no child recorded. It's just her. And I wonder whether maybe between Bunker offering her the passage and the next captain, I think it's Turnbull, offering her the passage, maybe her child had died, and she was completely alone at that point. Everybody else had gone. The two men, Kelly and William Lancashire, they had left on different ships. Catherine Haggerty's died, and it's just her that's left. So maybe it's something to do with that. But it's one of those imponderable things. What did change for her?
And this is what's so interesting about the research you've done, and just following the life of this woman's unusual life for this time and place. Like you just know she went on the ship, she departed here, and piecing it together, it's every turn is just so surprising and intriguing.
Yeah, that's right. It's like there's just little scraps of information though. So you can't even know what her internal life was. You can't really know why she made the decisions that she did. But, tracing her around the world, you have to assume she was a fairly remarkable person in order to survive all of this. Yeah, there must have been a level of bravery and courage and, going on there in order just to kind of get through it all. But yeah, the information is very, very sketchy, and she didn't leave anything. I think she was illiterate in terms of being able to write. I don't know whether she could read, but she couldn't write. So there wasn't a possibility of leaving anything behind. But yeah, I think what we do know about her is impressive for sure.
And her story continues on, although she's most famous for the mutiny situation, the time she spent among the Maori. And then there were some legends that she went to Tonga or she went somewhere else, but you've found that she returned and married someone.
Yes. So this is where what I wrote about and what you would tend to read in a New Zealand history book, this is where it kind of diverges, because this legend grows up that she stays in New Zealand. She doesn't leave after 6 or 8 months or so and go back and return to Sydney. the story is that she stays in New Zealand, she marries a high-ranking chief, and eventually I think it's about around 1820, she's supposed to have left New Zealand and potentially ended up in Tonga, is spotted in Tonga by an American whaling ship in 1826, and then maybe makes her way to America. And actually none of that happened. She did get picked up by the Indispensable and then taken to Norfolk Island, and then from Norfolk Island she returns to Sydney.
And at this point, I mean, she's a person who's had quite an adventurous life so far, but she is now a free woman. She's no longer a convict. She gets married, and she kind of, for her, I think probably it's a bit of a relief. She can now just live a quieter life.
Yeah, so she gets back to Sydney in 1807, not sure what happens for the next 3 or 4 years, but in 1811, she marries a soldier who's a bit older than her, and his name's Thomas Humphreys. And he is posted to various parts on the outskirts of Sydney. If anybody knows Sydney, Parramatta is now kind of reasonably inner city, but at the time it was on the outskirts. It was a frontier settlement, really, and they spent a lot of time in Parramatta and a place called Windsor. He's part of a garrison that is protecting Sydney from what is basically becoming a war between the colonial government and Aboriginal people as the settlement spreads out across the plain. So they kind of become indirectly involved in this kind of war of conquest.
Well, especially, I mean, as the wife of this military person, she would, I guess I said her life gets quieter, but I guess I mean, she's no longer being forced onto boats into unfamiliar places.
It's much more domestic, even if it's still, there's a level of danger to it.
And she's got a partner now. She's got a husband. It's not just her figuring things out on her own. And he's situated high enough in society that would have some level of security for her, I would think.
Yeah, he leaves the army. He retires in 1822. I think his battalion is disestablished, and he's offered a piece of land. So they have the opportunity to become farmers, smallholders, and I don't think that ever really comes about for whatever reason. His application kind of gets lost or whatever. So they end up living in Windsor, which is this at the time this frontier town. But they kind of disappear from the record for quite a long time. So I think they're just living a kind of settled, pretty normal domestic life. Which for her is probably the longest period of settlement that she's had.
Well, and it seems in a way her life, there were all these adventures in the middle, but at this point, I think it's turned out a bit better than it probably would have staying back in England as this poor person.
Yeah, well, I think this is one of the things that you find when you look at convicts, and one of the questions that's asked is, well, they got chucked out of their home country, but actually, in the end, was it better for them? Did they benefit? And certainly, some people did. I mean, there are some convicts who become very wealthy people. They serve their sentence, they're freed, and then they kind of get in on the whaling and sealing game, or they become landholders. They kind of build up, land holdings. And Thomas and Charlotte didn't get that far, but I think you can certainly mount an argument that her life may very well have turned out better in Australia than it would have if she'd stayed in Bromsgrove.
Was it during her lifetime that the myth started being built about her and the mutiny, or was it later?
It was later. So it was. We don't know when she died. There's absolutely no record of of her death. But in the 1890s, the myth about her starts to grow. So there's a writer of tall tales called Louis Beck, who he's kind of the first one that I could find who took the account that Samuel Rodman Chase had left behind of what went on the Venus when it was stolen, and he takes that story and he kind of embellishes it. So Rodman Chase doesn't mention Charlotte Badger at all. He does mention Catherine Haggerty, but he doesn't mention Charlotte Badger at all. But Louis Beck does, and he kind of has the two women taking an equal part in the mutiny. It's being led by Benjamin Kelly, but they're definitely active participants in the taking of the ship. So that's kind of where it starts, and I think he's the one who suggests that she may have gone to Tonga as well. So he's kind of the guy who starts building this myth about her, and what might have happened to her, when she comes to New Zealand and afterwards.
So during her life, then, she wouldn't have been living with any love of notoriety necessarily.
No, she's a complete unknown, really. And one of the questions I had was, well, when she gets back to Sydney, why isn't she charged with mutiny? Because, they know she's listed in this public notice when the Venus is taken. And yet when she gets to Norfolk Island and when she gets back to Sydney, the authorities don't try and charge her with, escaping, because escape from the colony wasn't unusual and it would be punished. And yet they didn't pursue her. And I kind of wonder whether they decided, well, she's just this poor woman and she got carried away and it was the men who led the mutiny, so we'll just kind of let her off. So yeah, she slips back into Sydney society and she disappears, really. She is, for the rest of her life, she's just a common or garden, released convict.
And I guess being in a place where so much of the European population there are former convicts, there's maybe not the same stigma there would be having that status back in England.
Yeah, I think most of the people there would be former convicts. So yes, if you're going to be a former convict, then you're probably better off staying in New South Wales, surrounded by people, just like you, and with, like we say, with the opportunity to kind of make a life of your own there.
And then she lives seemingly decades. There's no records, so presumably there's nothing too out of the ordinary happening to her. But then when she's in her 60s, she's suddenly charged with another theft. Is it theft again?
Yes, it's really strange. And I think, again, it's really hard to know why, but it seems to me like it's one of those things where it's a relationship that's gone wrong. And I think it's a neighbour potentially charges her with stealing something. She's found not guilty of that, so that's the good news. But it's really odd that decades really go by, and then all of a sudden there's this black mark on her record again. Yeah.
It's another one of those things. It's just everything about her story is just so intriguing, just these details we have. And so for me, I'm just trying to fill in the blanks. Like, what could have happened? Was she secretly a criminal this whole time? Or did somebody find out she had this record and so that's why they charged? I don't know. There's so many reasons why that could have happened.
Yeah. I mean, I sort of wonder, well, in order to survive the kind of life she had, did she have to be feisty? Did she have to be, did there have to be a kind of underlying level of, bolshiness about her? And did it eventually just come out in various ways? Because I'm not sure that you could be kind of meek and entirely kind of submissive and live the kind of life she had and survive it, really. So maybe she was a bit feisty and occasionally that went wrong, in her dealings with other people. Yeah, it's impossible to tell. It's frustrating that you can't tell.
And I think that's such a good point, that her personality, just based on the things that happened to her and the things that she did, you can't but come away with a sense of this feisty person, this very strong-willed person, that otherwise this whole life, the sequence of events doesn't make sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think breaking into someone's house when you're 18, I think you only do that if there's something about you that is willing to kind of, break the norms of society and be a bit feisty, and maybe that, in some ways that did just stick with her whole life, for good and for bad.
And what is her role nowadays in terms of New Zealand history?
Yeah, she's often written about as one of the first white or Pākehā women to come to New Zealand. That's kind of become her status. But she makes kind of very fleeting appearance. So if people have written general histories of New Zealand, if they're writing about the early contact period, the pre-colonial period, they'll kind of talk about her as an early emissary, or there's a term that we use here, Pākehā Māori, and you get these sorts of people. I'm sure you have them in Canada as well, where they're white people who make really early contact with native populations, indigenous populations, and they kind of live with those communities, and they become emissaries and contact points between, white traders and indigenous people. And she's kind of talked about in those terms as being one of these Pākehā Māori. Not actually sure that she really did fulfill that role. But yeah, that's kind of how she's talked about, as being an early cultural emissary and one of the very first white women to come here.
And her status, do you think she's more, not that she's not super well known in general, is my impression. I was asking, when I started researching this, I just asked my listeners, is anyone in New Zealand? I just want to understand this a bit better. And my New Zealand emissary, ambassador, had never heard of her. So I'm just guessing. I don't know how, but where she's better known, it's probably more New Zealand than Australia.
Definitely, yeah. Yeah, she doesn't really have any kind of status in Australia, which is sort of odd, because the two places that really beefed up the Charlotte Badger myth about, living in New Zealand for a long time, going to, Tonga, being the pirate, being the woman who led the mutiny. So Louis Beck, he was Australian, and then the Sydney Morning Herald in the 1930s, it writes this incredible story about how she was the mutiny leader. So the myth itself about her kind of formed mostly in Australia, and yet she really only appears in New Zealand history books. And it's because she was, supposed to be one of the very first Pākehā people to live here.
I had messaged you, I think, when we were planning this discussion. I have this scale where all the women who we talk about on the podcast, I give them scores out of 10 in 4 different categories.
Mm-hmm.
And so I never know what these numbers are going to be, especially when I have someone like you who's an expert in this topic. But so the first category, and these are all from 0 to 10, how scandalous do you think she is or was? And that's within the context of her lifetime.
Yeah, of her lifetime. Yeah, that's a good one. I mean, I think she has 2 really scandalous periods. One is where she does actually break into the house and steal the money, and the other is where she does take part in that mutiny. Even if she's not an active participant, she's on board, a ship that takes part in the mutiny. But then she has long periods of, domestic boredom. So I would probably give her a 6.
Mm-hmm. Because the scandal of the pirate and all that came later, and that's not really her.
Yeah, it's not really her. Although, yeah, she didn't she didn't lead the mutiny, but she definitely, she was on board, and she probably had the opportunity to get off, and she didn't. So
proximity to mutiny,
yeah,
I think, is inherently
proximity to mutiny, yeah, and deciding not to get off the boat because a couple of the crew members got thrown off the boat and sent back to shore. And I think maybe she'd said, I don't really want to be part of this. She might have had the option to go with them, and she didn't.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Definitely, yeah. She's not without scandal in her life.
She's not without scandal.
The next category I call scheminess, and that's just being a person with a plan. I mean, she had the scheme to break into the house, not a good scheme, clearly. But that also speaks to just resiliency and flexibility and being able to get through in unusual and unexpected circumstances. And I think she had that.
She definitely had that. I give her an 8 on that one. Yeah.
I mean, she's thrown into completely unfamiliar situations all in a row, and she came out of all of them.
Yeah. I mean, every phase of her life really has a series of pretty extraordinary challenges. Even the boring domestic part, she's still living on a frontier, in Australia. It's a harsh environment, and it's an environment that for white settlers is it's a frontier, really. So that she's living in a series of kind of new and challenging environments.
And I think too, I'm just thinking, I mean, I know much better the history of settlers in Canada or in the United States, but that's a lot of people who came here on purpose, who chose a life of adventure. She never chose this. She just kind of was put there.
She kind of, yeah. I mean, I guess you could maybe argue that she, breaking into the house, she's sort of choosing a path, but no, she didn't think that was, nobody commits a crime thinking they're going to get caught, do they? So yeah, it's a series of things that kind of happened to her.
And it just so happened her constitution, her personality actually was very well suited to this, but
yeah, potentially. I think in order to get through it all, you definitely have to be flexible, and resilient. I think that's the word that I kept thinking about in relation to her. She must have been an extremely resilient person.
Absolutely. And even talking about the children she had and the children who died, like that requires enormous resiliency.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So the next category is her significance. And so I would say specifically her significance, like as to New Zealand history, to Australian history. I think, and this is an interesting one to consider, because part of what I really appreciated about your book was to take a person who there's not a lot of biographies of a criminal woman from this period in English history, but just because her life became so extraordinary, there are these records. So to me, I find her significance almost representing a class of people who we never hear about. Yes.
And I think, to an extent, that's why she was added to the Dictionary of New Zealand Biography, partly because she is this early cultural representative, but also because she represents a class of women who comes later, and that's the single working class woman. And she is an early example of those single women who chose to get on a boat and come to the other side of the world, often to be domestic servants, because that represented a better option than staying in Britain. And I think you can see her as, even though she didn't come by choice, she was forced. You can sort of see that, she's an early representative of that young independent woman.
So on a scale of 0 to 10, where would you put her for significance?
For significance, I mean, I probably would overstate her significance, but
that you're the guest.
I would say that, I guess, but yeah. Again, I think I would probably go for like a 7. I think for around there, because like you say, she does represent a class of working class women who did come in numbers and contributed to the country. So yeah,
she's in the Dictionary of New Zealand Biography, you said, so Yeah.
She is. Yeah, she is. She is indeed.
Which
yeah.
I'm sure she would never have imagined.
No, I mean that's the thing, that she's this. On one hand, she's incredibly obscure. She's born at the very bottom of society. She's illiterate. She's lives this obscure life, and yet she's in the New Zealand, the Dictionary of New Zealand Biography, because on one hand she's not obscure. She lives this incredible life. So there's a real sort of dichotomy about her.
So the final category is, I call it the sexism bonus, where it's just how much did sexism hold her back? And it's a way to give people more points. And I don't know. I think if a man had broken into a house, maybe he would have been put to death. Or maybe he would have been also sent to Australia. I don't know how much her gender.
Yeah, that is a good one, because it's almost like the opposite. Because the sexism thing should have worked in her favor. So if she had a male accomplice, she would have been excused. And women were often, in the justice system, it was like, oh, well, we have to make excuses for her because she's been led astray. So it's almost like she kind of didn't benefit from sexism in a way.
And then in her life, I don't know, like I would think, I'm sure it was very scary being on the original convict ship, being surrounded by men. She had children. We don't know the circumstances of their conception. But again, I don't see sexism necessarily being a major force working against her in her story.
No. And I think, as I say, in a way, I sort of wonder if one of the men who'd been on board the Venus made it back to Sydney, would he have been charged with being an escaped convict? And maybe he would have, and maybe she wasn't, because she was just the poor little woman who'd been led astray. So maybe there's an extent to which the sexism of the time helped her to kind of, in that scenario, maybe it kind of worked in her favor.
And even when she choosing to stay among the Maori, I don't know, being a woman, if she was treated in a certain way that was positive or negative versus if a man had stayed.
Yeah, there's one account says that she and Catherine Haggerty, and when they're at the bay, they're subject to tapu, and tapu is like a sense of sacred protection which a chief can bestow, and so they were kind of living under the tapu of the chief. So that if that was correct, then they were definitely being protected, and I think there's a high chance that their gender was part of the reason for that.
This is so interesting. Yeah, it's not often on my podcast that sexism really is.
Yeah, it's not a corrosive force.
I would say give her like a 1 or a 2, just because I'm sure that.
Possibly I'd give her a 2, because it's going to be there, isn't it? So we got to acknowledge its existence. Yeah.
Let me just see. So that's 17. So her total score is a 23 out of 40, which I'm just trying to see if there's anyone who is well known enough. You might have heard of them who also got a 23. There's not. there's people who got 23, but I doubt they're not super famous people. Yeah. But actually, I don't know if you've heard of her. Mary Toft was an English woman from around this period. No, a bit earlier. But she allegedly gave birth to rabbits. And then it turns out she's just being used by various people to try. She was also a poor woman who we would never have known about, except this weird thing happened to her. And she has a 20. So I think this is a place where people who are significant in representing a class of people, that's kind of where they fall on the scale. But thank you so much for joining me to talk about this story. I'm really grateful for taking the time, and I'm also grateful for all the investigative work you did in putting together this biography, of going into, I think you said in the book, like different archives to find what was she charged with and what was her sentence and all these details.
Yeah, I mean, that's part of the fun, though. That's the fun part, is tracking someone down like her. It's kind of like, it is like doing detective work, but without without some of the downsides of having to be a detective. And so it's, I enjoy it immensely. And I was just glad in the end that I was able to kind of give some sort of shape to her life, because I think, yeah, she was a remarkable person, and I wonder how she'd feel about, all the attention that she's received from various quarters, having started off so low down in society, but having lived this amazing life. I think it's great that she's getting the attention that she deserves.
Absolutely. And thank you for helping giving her more attention by coming on my podcast.
Oh, thanks very much for having me. It's been really fun.
So because this is the Marie Antoinette season in a kind of Trojan horse way, where it's like you see a giant statue of Marie Antoinette and they open it up and inside are a bunch of like increasingly obscure, like poverty-stricken women from around the world. But I am connecting, everyone in this series is going to connect back somehow to Marie Antoinette. And you might be like, well, how is Charlotte Badger going to? Guess what? She does. So when she left New Zealand, the person who came to, I don't know if it's rescue is the right word, because she was doing okay, but the guy who she left with on a ship was Lieutenant John Putland. Lieutenant John Putland had served under a guy called Horatio Nelson when he was in the army. Honestly, a lot of the connections this series, and it's really telling to how the world was interacting at this time, are through these military type people. Horatio Nelson had spent some time in Naples, where he hung out with King Ferdinand IV, King of the Romans, whose wife, Maria Caroline of Austria, was the sister of Marie Antoinette. So from Charlotte to Putland to Nelson to King Ferdinand to Maria Caroline to Marie Antoinette is 5 degrees of separation. Or 4 degrees if you think like Nelson probably hung out with Maria Caroline directly. So let's say 4. Let's say 4 degrees of separation. And again, the book that Jennifer wrote is Thief, Convict, Pirate, Wife, The Many Histories of Charlotte Badger. So if you want to learn more about this whole story, it's such a good, readable, great book. I recommend it heartily. And this is Vulgar History. And my name is Ann Foster. I have other ways if you want to keep up with me and this podcast, if you just can't get enough. I do know that, or I suspect that because we just started this new season, there's probably some new listeners. And you might feel like the archive of old episodes is overwhelming. There's like 200 episodes or something. One episode that directly relates to this one, if you want to scroll back, you can find I did an episode about an Aboriginal Australian woman named Mary Ann Bugg. And that delves more into bush ranging, which are some of my favorite people from Australian history. They're sort of like Australia's version of highwaymen or cowboys. But Mary Ann Bugg, her story is really interesting, and it gets more into the history of Australia and also interesting of New Zealand, because later in her life, Mary Ann Bugg claimed to be of Maori descent just because of Australia was being colonized by the British, but New Zealand wasn't yet. And so Maori people had more rights. And so it seems like a thing that a lot of Aboriginal Australian people did, was to say like, oh no, I'm actually Maori. And then you'd be treated better. Anyway, so if you just scroll back to find my episode about Mary Ann Bugg, that's related content, I would say. You can keep up with me in various places. I am on Instagram at Vulgar History Pod. And that's where I post for every episode, just sort of like some pictures to illustrate what we're talking about. And also that's where you can get in touch with me, sending me messages there. I also have a Patreon, and the Patreon is another way that people are able to interact with me and to chat about the episodes. So if you join the Patreon, which you can join for free, I have some free content that's available there as well. And if you support the podcast for at least $1 a month, you get early ad-free access to all episodes, including older episodes. And you also get access to an episode discussion chat. So you can talk with me and with the other members of the Tits Out Brigade, which, new listeners, is who you are. That is the name of the listeners. It was voted on democratically several years ago by the listeners. So if you want to chat about the episodes, join the Patreon for at least $1 a month. There's a chat, and also you get the early ad-free access. If you join the Patreon for $5 or more a month, you get access to bonus episodes too. So you also get episodes of Vulgar Peace Theater, which is where there's a bunch of episodes of those. There's like more than 20 where I talk with my friends Alison Epstein and Lana Wood Johnson about various costume dramas, including we did an Australia-based costume drama, the Heath Ledger movie Ned Kelly. And there's also, when you join at the $5 a month level, there's a Discord. So that's another place where people can come and chat about the episodes. And I really want to emphasize the places where people can share their thoughts, because this season I'm really, really, really interested in what you're thinking. And if you have thoughts or ideas of other people who you think could add to this theme, I always want to hear from you. And I also have a Substack, which is a weekly newsletter I post, which it's not the same content as the podcast. So it's like completely different content. It's not just this podcast, but in words. It's called Vulgar History a la carte. At the moment, I'm talking about women from the Tudor era. So you can follow that at vulgarhistory.substack.com. And I have merch for the podcast. So a lot of the merch that we have is inspired from just like, I don't know, just moments that really took off with listeners in past seasons. Like there's, I did an episode about, or a couple episodes about Marie de Guise, who was this French woman who became Queen of Scots, her ongoing battles with this preacher, John Knox. And at one point she victoriously yelled, "Where is your God now, John Knox?" And so there's a design that says, "Where is your God now, John Knox?" I also have some merch that's inspired by just like silly reviews people leave of this podcast sometimes. Like there's one that says, "Unscholarly and rambling." Anyway, so there is merch available. It is at vulgarhistory.com/store. Or if you're outside the US, I suggest using the Redbubble store, which is vulgarhistory.redbubble.com. And as the season progresses, another reason why I'm just like, get in touch with me, join the chat, send me messages, is because I don't know yet what the merch is going to be for these episodes, but I want to have something amazing for this kind of segment for season 7, part 1, these revolutionary stories. And honestly, listeners come up with better ideas for merch than I often do. So let me know what your merch ideas are as well by sending me a message. I also have a brand partner who is Common Era Jewelry, which is a small woman-owned business that makes jewelry inspired by women from classical mythology as well as from classical history. So the beautiful pendants and rings and earrings. They make their pieces in gold and also in more affordable gold vermeil. So some of the people that, and mythological people you can get on their pieces, they have Sappho is there, Medusa, I have that necklace, Aphrodite, and also some women we've talked about on the show, like Boudica, Cleopatra, Hatshepsut, Agrippina. Although they're mostly classical history, there is also an Anne Boleyn necklace that I was really excited about, and I also have that one too. Anyway, if you want to shop there, they also have like, I should mention, they have like scrunchies, hair bows, other things. Vulgar History listeners always get 15% off your order from Common Era by going to commonera.com/vulgar or using code vulgar at checkout. And if you want to get in touch with me in another way, if you go to the website, which is vulgarhistory.com, there's a form there where you can get in touch with me there too. And so just as a teaser for next week, there's going to be another new episode next week. We're getting into June, which is Pride Month in a lot of countries. And so we're going to be having a story from queer history. It's also a story from trans history. And it's also a story from American history. I know there's a lot of American listeners who, you know what, sometimes have been like, you should do a story from American history. And I'm like, be careful what you wish for, because we're going to get into a bunch of American history stuff. And that starts next week. Actually, next week is not a be careful what you wish for. Next week is like a delightful story of American history. Coming up in a bit, though, I'm going to be getting into some founding fathers stuff. And I hope you're cool with me talking about those guys, because they're not as cute as they were in Hamilton when you actually read the history. Anyway, thank you for listening to Vulgar History. And until next time, keep your pants on and your tits out. Vulgar History is researched, written, and hosted by Anne Foster. That's me. The editor is Christina Lumagi. Theme music is by the Severn Duo. The Vulgar History show image is by Deborah Wong. Transcripts are written by Aveline Malik. Find transcripts of recent episodes at vulgarhistory.com.
Welcome to the small town of Chinook, where faith runs deep and secrets run deeper. In this new thriller, religion and crime collide when a gruesome murder rocks the isolated Montana community. Everyone is quick to point their fingers at a drug-addicted teenager, but local deputy Ruth Vogel isn't convinced. She suspects connections to a powerful religious group. Enter federal agent V.B. Laureau, who has been investigating a local church for possible criminal activity. The pair form an unlikely partnership to catch the killer, unearthing secrets that leave Ruth torn between her duty to the law, her religious convictions, and her very own family. But something more sinister than murder is afoot, and someone is watching Ruth. Chinook, starring Kelly Marie Tran and Sanaa Lathan. Listen to Chinook wherever you get your podcasts.
Hi, this is Rob Benedict.
And I am Richard Spate. We were both on a little show you might know called Supernatural.
It had a pretty good run, 15 seasons, 327 episodes.
And though we have seen, of course, every episode many times, we figured, hey, now that we're wrapped, let's watch it all again.
And we can't do that alone, so we're inviting the cast and crew that made the show along for the ride. We've got writers, producers, composers, directors, and we'll of course have some actors on as well, including some certain guys that played some certain pretty iconic brothers.
It was kind of a little bit of a left field choice in the best way possible.
The note from Kripke was, he's great, we love him, but we're looking for like a really intelligent Duchovny type.
With 15 seasons to explore, it's going to be the road trip of several lifetimes. So please join us and subscribe to Supernatural then and now.